Dr. James Fallon is a neuroscientist, biologist, professor at UC Irvine, the founder of a stem cell research company, and author, who discovered one day as he was examining the brain scans of criminals that he had the brain of a psychopath. He's since given a TED Talk on the subject that's been viewed over 2 million times, and I reached out recently to see if he wanted to talk. This was one of the most interesting and unexpected turns an interview has taken so far. We wound up talking about a whole range of subjects like Putin's brain, the meth-smoking dean at USC, how violence gets passed on through generations. It was a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, I'm here with Dr. James Fallon. Thank you for joining me.
Duncan, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. So we were just talking about this beforehand. How I became introduced to you was I had seen either your TED Talk or some video on YouTube where you spoke about how you discovered that your brain, the image of your brain, resembled in many ways that of a psychopath's or a criminal's brain. And I want to talk about that. But first, you were commenting on a previous podcast I had done with a couple of climate scientists, and you're a biologist. You're in the science world, the academy. Could you just, I hope it's still fresh, but can you just go over a little bit what your thoughts on that were? And the reason I ask is because I think it ties back into the question of empathy and psychopathy and what all these things mean.
Sure. I listened to a couple of the podcasts and I liked them, so that's why I called you back, because I thought you were all over them. That is, you were all over and you were well-informed, a smart guy. And one of the ones had to do with the climate change, global warming. You talked to two scientists who just come out with the book. So anyway, when I was talking to you just now, I mentioned that the first research I did as a college student back in the late 60s was on thermal pollution, global warming. And I took the class from a guy who had just graduated, was a student, a PhD student, of the guy who invented the term climate change from the 50s. So we had that. So I'd always been interested in the climate and the weather, even as a kid, but all through to now. So it was just one of these things I was always interested in and had done research on. But in listening to it, it was just reminded me that generally the climate change people are, there's always such a political angle to it, and that it's a real turnoff to a fair number of people. If you got somebody like Al Gore, who is so polarizing, it's just,
right.
You're dead in the water. You can't get anything done because nobody, people don't trust him. He's very self-serving, narcissistic. He's a religion student. He never took statistics, biology, anything, and he's always passionate. And I mentioned to you, with all the students I've had for over 40 years as a scientist,
right.
Passion is one of the enemies of being a scientist. Passion is basically using emotion to try to make judgments on matters of objective truth. It doesn't. And so I always give this kind of pep talk to my students, whether they're undergraduate, graduate, medical students, et cetera, through the research. I said, I don't want any passionate people here. I said, just the interest of the subject matter of science should be enough to drive and motivate you for years.
All right.
So passion is for people in religion and politics, and it has no place in science. This is a really pretty self-motivating thing. But somebody like Al Gore, I mean, he's really a divinity student who got passionate, and so I always tell my students that we always try to create a narrative. The human brain tries to create a story. So if there's any pattern there anyway, you're always snapping to some conclusion that you hold on to dearly, even when it's wrong. So I said, every day you got to go in as a scientist, not saying we're here to prove this point, but the idea is we're here to disprove our point because we're probably wrong, and we always want to create a story. So I always go the opposite way. So whenever I hear somebody's passionate about something, I say, "Oh, you run the other way, right?"
Right.
But they have the wrong guys leading them because there are always these people who, the political leaders of this who try to make believe they're scientists. They never sound like scientists, guys.
Right.
They never do, and they're not. And but there's always been this political bent to it. And
that's what I wanted, because what I thought was so fascinating when you said that passion in a scientist, you run the other way. It's looping in the question of psychopathy, or a lack of empathy, a sort of coldness.
Yeah.
Could you describe what that is like in yourself, and how does that? Because it sounds like my picture of the psychopathic brain that you've put forward doesn't seem to be violent, but more is just a different sort of orientation of the mind, and it seems to help you in terms of science be able to look at things objectively. Would you say that's true?
I think so. I certainly hope so.
No.
And but the way that empathy ties in with the idea of people who are passionate about climate change, or Marxists, or nationalists, or people who just care about themselves, like psychopaths, for example. But if you look at two major kinds of empathy, one is an axis. If you look at a double-headed arrow, at one end is emotional empathy. This is what most people think of empathy, and this is what they want in a mate, in a best friend. And that kind of emotional empathy, is when you see somebody and you interact with them, and when they're happy, you're happy. When they're sad, you're sad. They cry, you cry. That is, you connected emotionally. You feel actually what they're going through.
Right.
This is different than at the other end of the spectrum is cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is, what people are thinking and feeling, right? Mm-hmm. And they're upset, but you don't feel their pain, but you understand it. So you actually understand it, and you can do a lot of good with that. Many people in eleemosynary, that is in charity work, have cognitive empathy, but no emotional empathy. And it turns out that most of the people that really give money and time and do everything are people with cognitive empathy, not the people who cry. When they see, if you see somebody who cries when they see the white polar bear floating around on the alone, and they'll start, sobbing softly, or they'll see a poor kid. Those people tend not to be the ones who do anything about it. They get emotionally upset and they seem empathetic, and people go, "Oh," but they're not the people who give money or do anything. It's people with cognitive empathy that seem so cold. And these are actually different connections in the brain form these two separate types of empathy. And there's different genetics behind it, different alleles, genetic alleles behind these different kinds of empathy. So that is the emotional versus cognitive empathy. Now, people at one end that have zero emotional empathy are psychopaths, and the people who have a lot of emotional empathy but no cognitive empathy are people like autistics, right? And so they're sort of opposite, and they get confused about it a fair amount. But those are at the opposite ends. Now, just because you have no emotional empathy, it doesn't mean it's pathological. It's just one of the traits. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
Of 20 traits that are involved in those, either one in autism, the other in psychopathy. The other type of empathy has to do with in-group versus out-group. There are people who all they care about is their own family or their own clan, okay? Their family and extended family. And then there are people who care, they don't care so much about, their family or their clan. They care about the world. So people who are Greens, like an honest Marxist, not really political ones, but the ones who really feel connected to all the children of the world or to the planet, have the full out-group empathy. And sometimes those people, if you look at people like Mahatma Gandhi, okay, so if you look at Gandhi, you read anything or hear anything of what his family, his wives, his family said.
Oh yeah, he beat his wife.
Oh, absolutely. And he cared about all the children of the world, all that thing. but was just a terrible husband, terrible parent. If you listen to who else? Mother Teresa was another one who loved all the children of the world, but it was awful. At one-on-one or small groups, terrible. She didn't really care about people per se. She cared about all the children of the world. That's outgroup. Mm. I think the third one is a better example. If you listen to the talk by Nelson Mandela's daughter at his memorial, at the funeral, said this was a great man, but you did not want to be his daughter. Very often you find these leaders who are trying to save the world absolutely have no use for individual people, including their wives, their family, etc. That's outgroup. And it's a kind of wiring.
Yeah.
You can find in some mothers, the mothers who don't really care about their own babies, like until they grow up, they're sort of like guys. And that is not abnormal. It's being wired for cognitive empathy and sort of outgroup and not in group. Well, any rate, I gave this talk at this international investors meeting at their board for the year, and there was a really well-known senator there who was the chairman of the board. And I used distribution of personality types and the distribution of empathies in the United States. And this was back in the summer of 2016. And I said, when people are under stress, they will snap back to their natural sort of genetic type of empathy they're wired for. So if they're scared or under some stress, that's what they'll use in voting. And I did this analysis and showed it to them. And I said, based on where we are now, Donald Trump's got to win this election. And it was 20 points or something. And they said it's impossible. Well, the senator was after the election. He emailed me. He says, now I know I vote for assholes. And he said, I don't know how you were right, but that analysis by not only personality distribution, but by empathy types seems to have worked. So you can use it for economics and politics and religion. I'm on the Vatican Arts and Technology Council, trying to help the Pope, express himself to individuals, because he's kind of an in-group, touchy-feely guy. He's emotional empathy. Yeah. And so I was trying to find ways of how do you articulate that and contact people individually. So it affects a lot of things. I work with the military, and same thing with the type of soldiers you are. So it has very broad applications. That is how you're wired, and it seems to be you're fundamentally wired a certain way through your genetics and brain connections.
That's so fascinating. Wait, just going back a second, what are you exactly doing with the Vatican?
Well, I was asked to be on this. They just started an Arts and Technology Council 3 years ago. Yeah. And one of the ideas is the Pope said that he was frustrated because he's usually talking to 10 or 20,000 people.
Right.
And it's a turnoff for him. He's a one-on-one guy.
Yeah.
Or somebody who likes to sit around at a small dinner table and talk to people. It's a kind of introversion, but that's who he's connected to. So he's very frustrated. And he is has a lot of emotional empathy. And so it's like, well, is there anything through technology we can use? So I have one associate I met at one of the Google meetings I go to, the Google camp, who is expert in Hollywood on this. And he had done the VR work for Bono and also for Sidra, the Syrian refugee camp, really excellent. And then also with an expert at the University of California, San Diego, different kind of VR, volumetric VR, and to see if there was a way of presenting with VR to transmit a sense of personal emotional empathy. So that was the one of the charges.
Interesting. That's because I had heard you tell that story about the predicting Donald Trump winning before, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying when you said having emotion form our judgments about objective truth. To what extent, when you look at the political landscape today, just as a biologist, someone who understands human cognition, to to what extent are we just trapped in narratives? I mean, can we ever break out and really see things as they are, or is this just a permanent fact of the human condition?
I think it cycles. I've tried to, because I've been asked to give talks at the Human Rights Foundation, and I work a lot with organizations that try to overthrow despotic, tyrannical governments.
Right.
So, and I meet with, through these organizations, I meet with the opposition, and the people who are the dissidents, and so we invite them to give talks. This is in Syria, Cuba, Russia, North Korea, etc. So I get to meet these people, and I started by doing an analysis of the mind of a dictator. So I went through 5,000 years of dictators where we had enough knowledge about their early life and everything. They have a very similar pattern, and then I meet with them, and I just did for the Human Rights Foundation a talk for Putin Con. And that was
there's a Putin Con.
Putin Con, yeah. It's held in Hell's Kitchen, which sounds tough. I mean, it's like it's a pretty funny place in Manhattan with that name. But at any rate, so I gave a talk on Putin's brain and how he fit against other tyrants, and the type of empathy they seem to have. Now, you can't really tell unless you're a trained psychiatrist and you talk to them for days. So, right. And there's the Goldwater rule that the American Psychiatric Association put out in 1968, because a bunch of Democrats got together and said that Goldwater is too crazy to be president, unstable. They did the same thing with Trump. I didn't vote for Trump or Goldwater, but nonetheless, it's just a political ploy.
Right.
So you get a bunch of lefties from Yale, these young psychiatrists, and they're very passionate, and they say that somebody like Donald Trump is mentally unstable. This is considered unethical. Plus, you can't do it practically because you can't tell if somebody's got a real personality disorder like psychopathy versus sociopathy, or narcissistic personality disorder versus just the traits of a narcissist. And all successful leaders are narcissists. So it doesn't,
right.
It's not a pathology. It's not a personality disorder. But at any rate, so that's how I get involved with that. But in order to learn more, I spent hundreds of hours going through all the lead-ups and in all the wars for the past 200 years, just to see how things get under stress, like critical points in time, where if you draw a Venn diagram over the different political factions, you can see that there either overlap or, like right now, there isn't overlap, right? You've got
right.
with the left and the right. And whereas for the past almost 100 years in the United States, there was overlap. And now there is an overlap. And if you look at these other lead-ups to war, that's what happens, is that there's no overlap. So you can't compromise. You can't even talk to each other. And that's what happened, in the Paris Commune, in the 19th century. And in most of the lead-ups to the world wars and really strong conflicts, where the left and the right get so far apart that you're in trouble. So this cycles, right? So I'm trying to see how that cycles, because even psychopathy itself cycles in individuals when they're kind of really feel compelled to murder or rape or be involved in the strong psychopathic behavior.
So what you've said before, you said before that you're not like you were lucky that you got raised by loving parents and that violent traits or anything like that didn't get activated in you. But for you, someone who considers himself or is a psychopath, what are strong psychopathic behaviors?
Well, first of all, I'm a self-diagnosed normal person.
Okay.
The problem is I have a lot of traits that put me, a pro-social borderline psychopath. And,
okay.
And one psychoanalyst who examined me, what he said in the summary is that here's a patient or subject that has all the drives and urges and dreams and mentations of a full-blown psychopath. He simply doesn't act any of them out, which he thought was odd. But if you look at my PET scan, it does kind of fit that, because I have the PET scan of a pure psychopath. That is, those areas that have to do with emotional regulation and the social brain, the emotional social brain, which is the limbic system, cortical limbic system. Those areas are completely turned off rather, in tests that test for empathy and aggression, etc. And I also have the genetics, the alleles that I inherited from my parents are ones that are associated with psychopathy. In each of the probably 350 complex adaptive behaviors of humans, each is regulated by a bunch of genes, right? Maybe an average of 15 major genes. And the alleles are either high or low forms of the regulation of these behaviors. So in my case, I inherited very high forms of almost all of the aggression related genes from my parents, and almost all of the low emotional empathy, and almost all of the low anxiety, low stress forms of these alleles. So in terms of the two main biological markers, that is the genetics and also my connectomes, that is the implied connections of my brain based on not only PET scans, but EEG, that it's consistent. But just because you have the biological determinants, if you will, or association,
Right.
doesn't mean you're that category. You don't have that categorical disease. There's something missing. So you can have all the traits of a psychopath, but they're not fixed. And how these become fixed, that is, they lose their context dependence on the situation. For example, there's nothing wrong with murdering. Somebody comes into your house and they want to kill your family and you kill them. That's fine. It's perfectly legal, normal, moral. So it's not the killing per se. And same thing with sex. Sex, there's nothing wrong with it, but you shouldn't be doing it on the street in front of your house, So
Sure.
all the behaviors of psychopaths are normal, except that they're done out of context. It's not done in the right, the contextual situation. And so socially it's inappropriate. That's what makes it pathological. But also, a lot of people will have these traits, and they'll have individual traits, but they're not, they're not marked. That is, they don't get fixed permanently in your youth. And what that means is that epigenetically, the epigenetics basically are the genes you have, but the genes that are actually expressed, because a lot of genes are turned off, right? You may have them, but they're not turned off. Well, usually what happens in situations like when you get sick, when you get angry, these things, these genes can be turned on and then they turn off. So the turning on and off is normal and very adaptive. But when you have them turned on all the time, because these little methyl groups have been added to the regulators of the genes, then you've lost context dependence and it's kind of permanent. And that's when the difference between having the traits and having the real disorder, like a personality disorder, because they're turned on all the time or turned off all the time, the appropriate ones. So that's the difference.
Sure. So that makes sense. I mean, that somebody could have sort of traits either that are like dormant or that only manifest themselves in certain situations. So, I mean, but having that kind of brain, it has to manifest itself somehow in the world, right?
Yep. And
is that ever, sorry, when you're does that ever feel like a lonely existence? In other words, if you're low on empathy but have high cognitive empathy, have no real need for other people, does that, I don't know, is there a burden to that?
No.
Spoken like a true psychopath.
Yeah, no, I don't care. I really, at the end of all this analysis and all this psychiatrist and everything, and they said, well, you're borderline. You're really not a full-on trigger one. And it was clear because I was brought up so well. I was really loved, and my mother, and especially in my aunts, especially, they saw there was something wrong with me when I was going into puberty, and so and my mother and all of my aunts were very highly educated. We come from a Sicilian family on that side, and their father, my grandfather, lived on the streets. At 11 years old, comes over really poor, an immigrant, just living on the streets, and was never educated. But he said, look, if I have kids, especially daughters, they're all going to get a college education. So they did. And they also have graduate degrees, but a lot of them are teachers, plus there's something else, either a nurse or a business person. And so they're very hip, very smart. And they all could see something was wrong, right? Yeah. With me. And I was really taken care of very well. And my mother told my teachers, make sure he keeps busy all the time. And I didn't know this until a few years ago when my mother told me. She's 100, almost 102 now, and she started telling me things. I said, "Ma, you got to come clean here. What happened?"
Yeah.
And they said, "Well, I was really quite worried about you. We were really quite worried about you." And she started telling me these things. But she said, because if you were bored, the moment you're bored, you really were very mischievous. She said, naughty. So, and I would, typically, like we were in. I be involved like stealing cars. I made a lot of explosives and all this stuff, and did things that I thought were just kind of normal. And
right.
and it were, the people I hung around with, it was. And at that time, if you were making bombs up, people didn't say you're a terrorist. They just said, well, he's interested in chemical engineering. And wow. if we stole cars, we like fill them up with gas when you turn them.
Did you really? You would steal a car, take it out for a ride, and then you'd fill it up with gas and give it back.
Absolutely. And so, and anytime we'd steal something, we'd bring it back. The car was Simonized and the brakes were aligned. And so the guys I hung around with were fairly, I would say, smart guys who get into mischief. And so,
how many of them went on to become professors at universities and have TED Talks? And
none of them.
Okay.
One of them pulled off the largest not heist, but the largest drug deal. He was my best friend early on, and he became famous for like paying off judges and smuggling all this dope from the Caribbean. And the guy was just brilliant and fun, and spent grade school through high school and beyond. And he's one of these guys that could have been like a senator, but he kind of went the other way. And another one, they were smart and smart guys, but I remember a few years ago, I hadn't seen a lot of my college classmates much, but after I wrote my book, one of the guys who I knew kind of got together again. We're at the age, you're kind of contacting each other again because you're retiring and all that. And he goes like this, and we went to college, and he said to me about 6 years ago, he said, well, he said, in 1978, I took a girl out as a first date. And he goes, I'd never like go to a movie and dinner on a first date. But he said he happened to do that. He brought this girl to this movie, and he's sitting in the movie theater, and halfway through the movie, he goes, I went to school. I know this guy. I went to school with this guy. And everything that's going on, I saw this guy do. And it was, Animal House, and he was talking about John Belushi. I did all of that stuff, right? But it was more like pranks. But you could get in trouble. A lot of the things I did, the people with me would spend a night in jail. But whenever I talked to the police, they'd always go, no, this guy's just in it for the fun. He wasn't. And I was the one that kind of the instigator of the whole thing. But the cops, I'd always make them laugh. And I never showed any stress or anxiety, acted kind of innocent, like a fun guy, which is what I thought it was, you see. But the other ones would act guilty, and they always got in trouble. So my experience over the years is I do all these things that were sort of rambunctious. I never meant to hurt anybody. I did, right, but didn't mean to. And so I always thought it was really like just being a regular guy. So I always just consider it like normal behavior, but I found out it's not, right? Yeah. And the people I grew up with, some of you are like a completely wild guy. And I get people into situations that they didn't like. And, but they go along because they usually have a lot of fun. And I did like crazy stuff, right? And so for me, it was just that sort of thing. Now, I've had a great time in my life. I'm completely happy. I wouldn't change any of it. Yeah. And so when the psychiatrists, two of them I was talking to, well, one and then another one, I said, well, now that you know that you probably are borderline psychopath and you really kind of hurt people and didn't know. And what do you think of it? And I said, I don't care. They said, well, that's the problem. You don't care. And I really don't. I wouldn't. You know,
You want to change it?
no, no. And so, but that I guess follows the idea, because I don't feel any sort of remorse or embarrassment or anything like that. And it's not that I want to hurt anybody, especially, my wife and kids and grandkids and everything.
Yeah.
But they, when I kind of found this all out quite by accident back in 2005, absolutely by accident. And I came home and I said to my wife, I said, the damnedest thing just happened. I said, I did all these PET scans of these criminals, these murderers, and, separate them out in different patterns, whether they're impulsive or they were psychopathic or just disorganized murderers. I said, my brain pattern, not because I was in that study, it was a different study.
Yeah.
My brain pattern looked just like the worst psychopath that I had looked at in this pilot. She goes, it doesn't surprise me. Which, curious at the time, I said, and I remember later, I said, remember saying that? And she just, yeah, she was serious.
Yeah.
And but it was just, I thought, a very curious thing. And
You still with me?
yeah, I thought that the technicians had switched the scans, but they hadn't.
Yeah.
And so I pulled the name tag off and saw my name on these very pathological scans. I just kind of laughed. I said, I get the joke. Okay, I've been studying these murderers, and now I'm the one who's got the psychopathic pattern. So, universe one mean nothing. But I thought it was just funny. And so I became my own experiment, I guess. But I didn't care about it for several years until later on, after about 5 years later. But in that time period, I gave a TED talk, and then things got out of control.
What do you mean they got out of? Oh, I think you're on your end. You might have the audio going directly out, or no, never mind.
Not a second. The audio is,
as long as you're wearing headphones or something. Just if you play the sound of my voice talking, it'll get picked up by your mic and sound like feedback.
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you. Can you hear me?
I don't hear any feedback.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you want me to restate here?
No. I think what I was, what were we just talking about? When you're looking at these brain scans and you say it got out of control after the TED talk, what do you mean it got out of control? As in things exploded?
A couple of years after the PET scans, I kind of forgot about it because I had to get like $7 million together to start a stem cell company. So I was raising money, and then we were getting patents and papers out on schizophrenia and Alzheimer's on these genes. So I didn't even care about my own scans. I'd forgotten about it, but I contacted by the TED people, and they said, you got a story? And I said, yeah. I said, I got a story. And it was about the stem cells, our stem cells, because we were the first ones in my lab to show how to mobilize lots of stem cells in the brain naturally, natural peptide and the endogenous stem cells that are already in your brain. It's not embryonic. So, and they go, well, yeah, that's but there's a lot of bias against this. I was talking about the scientific bias against it. And so at any rate, they said, well, yeah, that's okay. But do you have any personal story? And this is my second mistake, was to tell them about this thing with my, the psychopathic brain pattern. And they go, that's it. Tell that story. So I told that story. And after I told it, they hadn't started putting these TED Talks on YouTube as a regular thing. They put on Bill Clinton or Al Gore, those big ones, but not the little ones.
Right.
And so, and that was back in 2009. And so they started to do it. And I'm at the party, the TED party, everybody's getting drunk. And I ended up signing some release on a video. I didn't even realize it. Well, I thought I did.
Wow.
Nobody'd ever see it. Then it sounded like they pulled a fast one, but this was not a thing then. They were showing all these TED Talks, right? There was only a couple. And so it's like, sure, I'll sign whatever. I never thought anybody'd see this. But at any rate, after 5 months, they put it on. I didn't even know it. And I started, the next morning, I got all these different emails from my colleagues and friends. They said, overnight, you got like 30,000 hits. on your on your TED talk. I said, what are you talking about? And so that was followed by me being contacted by different producers and also literary agents.
Yeah.
Very quickly, and to try to get me to write a book and everything, but I got contacted by Simon Mirren, who was a showrunner for Criminal Minds. He says, "You got to come up and act." He says, "I heard your TED talk, and I know what you're talking about." And he got it. I couldn't believe it. He says, "This isn't a story about you. It's a story about how violence is transferred in neighborhoods over many years of abuse, etc." And he wrote a teleplay, and it became episode 99 of Criminal Minds, called Outlaw. Wow. And it was like I think their most popular one. And it's also, not because I was on it, but it's the most popular because after episode 99, they go into syndication and they all make a lot of money, right? So that was but anyway, so then people saw that not only the TED talk, but then they saw the Criminal Minds thing. And I started getting contacted from all over the place. 2009, and then, but I still didn't do anything about it. I still didn't take it serious. It was just seriously. It was just a lark. But 2010, I was asked to give a talk with the ex-prime minister of Norway, and so I was contacted by the president of the University of Oslo. And here's a guy, a politician, a European politician, a Scandinavian politician, admitting that he had a psychiatric disorder during his first term. I thought it was amazingly brave.
Right.
So he gave a talk, and I gave a talk with him.
What was his psychiatric disorder?
Bipolar.
Okay.
So he had bipolar at the beginning of his first term, and he got treated, and he went on to have 2 very successful, terms as prime minister. So it turned out great, and it was a great lesson for people. You get treated, get analyzed, treated, and don't be ashamed of it. So it was, I thought, a wonderful thing he did.
Did people know he was bipolar while he was in office?
No, he just came out and told everybody.
Okay.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. Europeans don't do this, and definitely Northern Europeans and definitely Scandinavians don't ever admit that there's anything wrong with them, right? And so I thought it was remarkable. But so I had to use data to show how we have a mathematical model, a statistical model, to show what genes are associated with different disorders, psychiatric disorders. Because the group at UCI, our group was, I think, the first really to do analyses leading to, personalized medicine, because we used everybody's genetics and the brain scans, and we had a method that we patented on how to put all of these together to show with a low number of subjects, what genetic alleles are associated with certain disorders. So I used my own data. I showed all my genetics. I showed my PET scans. I showed all of my symptoms of my whole life, and to show people, because it was the only one I could ethically use is my own data. And so at the end of the talk, the guy stood up and he said, and he's the chair of the Department of Psychiatry there, and he says, "Thanks for the talk." He says, "First thing, you're bipolar and you don't know it." And he says, "Because you never get depressed. You're always up, though. You're hypomanic," which is true. And the second thing, we got to talk to you afterwards. So I met them afterwards at the president of the University of Oslo's house, and we had cocktails that went on for 4 or 5 hours. And I talked to these psychiatrists. And after a few hours, they said, "You know something? We looked at all your data, and you're probably a borderline psychopath." That was the first time. That was 2010. Yeah. That I took it seriously, because these guys weren't kidding me. They didn't know me other than the data. They looked at me clinically, and that's when everything changed.
When you say everything changed, it sounds like it was a load of attention at once, or something that you thought was relatively innocuous became blown up into a huge deal. What is it like? I mean, because when I think psychopath, I imagine that a person like that would just love tons of attention.
I'm a ham anyway, and I'm narcissistic, but it's not the kind of attention you want.
Okay, how so?
Oh, well, no psychopath wants to be known as a psychopath. You know what I mean? It's just not. Sure. I want to be caught, and I didn't. For me, I was happy with it because I knew I wasn't a psychopath.
Yeah.
It was just like I must have had the theory wrong. But as it turns out, my theory wasn't wrong because I was kind of the first person to show the whole pattern, right? And I just figured, I got my science wrong. But it turns out I didn't. And so at that point, it was kind of for keeps. And I have no urge to hurt my family, my wife, my kids, my grandkids.
No.
But they went along with it. They said, hey, you're a professor, you know this stuff, we know who you are, you know yourself. And why don't you talk about it, and maybe you can help people and, teach some science and psychiatry at the same time. So they really went along with it. But in terms of any sort of glory, there's no glory. There's no glory in it, because you know what I mean. It's interesting and quirky, but it's not something you would do. It's not something I would do, because I really had enough love and attention already in my life, definitely.
Yeah.
And I was doing shows. I was doing History Channel and other things already. It's not like you know what I mean. And I went. So it wasn't really a big deal at all, and it still isn't a big deal. But it's an opportunity to teach, right, to the average person about genetics and about psychiatry and about personality disorders and about crime and all this. So it's as a professor, you're supposed to be talking about this if you know anything, right?
Right.
And it sounds like I'm an expert on this, on psychopathy or genetics or anything, but I know enough that I can talk about it. And my family said, go for it, write the book and whatever. But my wife is a very private person,
right?
And my kids really are too, and my grandkids are really kind of private. So when years ago the BBC came and stayed with us, and it's like a special me and the family.
Yeah.
And this is the only time she's ever done an interview. And she said, "Look, I'm married to two guys." She said, "This one guy is like a lot of fun. I love him. He's very interesting. He's got all these friends that are interesting, and it's an exciting life, and it's great." He says, "There's this other guy I do not like at all. It was this dark character, and I do not like this guy." And that was she said that's the first and last interview. So you really don't want to hear this, but it was true. It's not. There's no glory in this. But anyway, there's truth in it, however, and this is how people feel, and so I try to use that in a responsible way, and give talks about it to the best I can. But I'm still manipulative. But I'm trying to, starting about 5 years ago, once I came back from this talk, I got fully analyzed when I got an analysis done.
Yeah.
Well, how do I deal with? What do I do now? Now, if this is true, because I was just didn't give a shit. But and so I said I went on this little journey, and I started to try to change my behavior, because I have enough narcissism that I said, look, I know you can't reverse psychopathy, but I can. I'm that good. So I tried to use my own sort of psychopathic traits, my own narcissism and ego, to drive this, to give it energy, so I would try to become and act like a normal person and not manipulate people. I would try to manipulate people and always playing them. Not to get anything from them. It's just to own people. To be, when you sit there, you want to own somebody. That is, your mind right now for the next 5 minutes or 3 hours. I own you, you see.
Yeah.
And that's basically how it expresses itself. But it's still psychopathy. Because I don't need sex. I don't need to, murder people. I don't need power. I got all power and success I want. So I have no need, but there's still a fundamental drive all the time, whether I'm in a bar or at a party or anything like that, or talking to people, to own them. And my wife will pull me aside, because I'll usually be talking to go to a party, and then I'm surrounded by about 10 people telling stories, right? And we're all like, and they're true stories. I don't lie. I try to manipulate people purely with the truth. And she goes, "You're doing that thing again. Could you don't do that?" And she doesn't like it, you see. And other people don't like it, because it's like, Mr. Look at me, right? And I said, "Well, I'm not doing this for attention." She goes, "It doesn't matter. You're just taking all the oxygen out of the room for everybody, and it's pissing me off." So I tried to change this, and I started with my wife, and just my interactions with her. I didn't tell her I was doing it, but I said I started to look at what I considered normal guys my age, people I knew, did, and I saw that when people weren't looking, they were really sacrificing themselves, and something I really wouldn't do. And so I every interaction with my wife, very simple things about being a good roommate, who pours the wine for who cleans up, who does, regular things, but also more serious things like going to her aunt's funeral or something like that. Because I'd always like come up with an excuse, blow it off, and go down to a beach bar and just hang out all day.
Yeah, sure.
Very common for me to do is to, and there's so many of these. These are considered psychopathic when because I will make up a story so I don't have to go somewhere, right?
Right.
So I started to do all these things, and after 2 months of every time I was uh, uh, about to have an interaction with my wife, I asked myself, what would a good guy do here? What would a good person do? And I tried to do that. And first of all, after 2 months, she goes, "What has come over you?" I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "You're like a really, really good guy." And
Wow.
I told her, I said, "Don't take it seriously. It's just like an experiment I'm doing, right? To see if what it takes to be like a regular guy." But the second thing, I found out that it was so exhausting. Uh, and I usually, since I was a teenager, slept 4 hours a night, and that's all I needed. And now, with me trying to be like act like a good guy and responsible, and thinking about how what I'm saying and doing affects the other person, I became so exhausted every night. I started to sleep like 6 hours. It started to creep up.
Wow.
It was so exhausting.
It affected your sleep patterns.
Completely. It just absolutely. Now that's it. It increased the amount of sleep by 30%. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And then it just struck me. I said, when because those areas of the brain in social interactions do not work in me, right? Orbital cortex, ventromedial cortex, the empathy part. Um, I'm not caring how I'm affecting the other person. Now I didn't know this, right? I just assume everybody's in my head. I'm a normal guy,
Yeah.
but when you start considering, when I say this, am I hurting people? Am I hurting this person? Am I, you know, and then don't do that. That was exhausting. And so it was like, oh, that's what it means to be a nice guy. And it really slowed me down. So instead of being really glib and talking fast, I started to be careful about what I was saying. And then I did it with other people, my friends and my colleagues, and they all noticed it because I didn't tell each one of them I was doing this, right?
Right.
And they really noticed a difference, and that was a surprise. But the biggest surprise was really my wife's and another friend's response. I told them it wasn't serious; it was just like an experiment. I was like the part of the experiment. I was just part of the experiment, and they were. And they both said, "We don't care." He said, "My wife's first one to say, she said, I don't care if it's, you're not, you don't really mean it." She says, "You're treating me better. That's what I care about."
Yeah.
And they really, you don't care if I mean it? She goes, "No, you're just treating me better." And that was like, holy gee, no, that's people just want to be treated better. That you don't have to be like completely honest and earnest about it. And that was really surprised me. So the I think the most amazing thing is finding out that other people have in their normal reactions uh, act in a way that I don't at all, right? And they don't care about things that I would think would be important to them, and so that's been kind of illuminating. But the other thing is that I still value. I'm involved in a lot of charities, and I because it's the right thing to do, and it's not a moral or ethical thing. It's just I think not being bad, but trying to be good or being goodness itself is not a moral or ethical thing. It's just I don't know, it's a beautiful way to act. It's a matter of aesthetics. You know,
As in, when you say it's a matter of aesthetics, do you mean it's about appearances, or do you mean it's a matter of this is how you want the world to function?
this is how the world should function. It's nothing to do with, if I was alone in the middle of the woods and I tried to help a little bird, that's something you do. It's
Right.
not. It's not. There's nobody watching. No. That has nothing to do with that sensibility. Has never and still doesn't have anything to do with this. It's just like since I'm an agnostic, I really don't believe God and everything. It's not that I'm an atheist, but um, and I don't believe in heaven or hell or all this stuff and morality. I don't have a sense of the duality of morality. Do you know what I mean? It just
Sure.
it's there. I don't really believe in evil or really good by itself, but I believe in the aesthetics of beautiful living, if you will. And and that's what I look for in people.
I feel like this sounds like some people I know who, when they got to college, they started reading like Nietzsche, and were like, man, beyond good and evil. Would you say that that's like an accurate characterization of what you're going after?
Well, since I'm not very proficient in the classics,
Sure.
uh, I, I really didn't know that. But if it's consistent with it, and looking
Right.
at what they wrote, it is consistent with that. But it doesn't depend at all on morality or good and evil at all. It's
Mm.
just the it's just has a beauty. If you look at a beautiful work of art, I don't you don't look at it and say what's the morality of this, or usually
Right.
you
Yeah.
would, it's just beautiful, and so it's like behold the beauty, and so that's something I always felt even as a kid, that it was things were just beautiful, and therefore living, doing things that way would be beautiful. But I was not really. I thought that it seemed that I was doing that, but I was really pissing people off or hurting
Yeah.
people. It was finding out that I wasn't really doing what I thought I was doing, or it was who I thought I was. That was a surprise because I always thought I was a really terrific guy.
When when you talk about trying to change your behavior, um, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I know you said you had been to Burning Man, so I thought this might be relevant to you. Maybe not, but have you uh, have you thought at all about, just as like a neuroscientist, about the effects of like psilocybin has been shown, at least while you're taking it, to increase neuroplasticity in the brain. Um, would you say that that's I know that there's like a MAPS study coming out where they're using MDMA to like treat people with PTSD and victims of trauma to basically like rewire their brain. Is that something that you're at all attuned to or think would be helpful in improving behavior?
Well, there's plasticity, brain plasticity is way oversold, and
Okay.
our brain systems, for example, the unmyelinated axon tracks of the dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, the monoamine systems that kind of tune up and tune down different connections in the brain. Those are naturally plastic, and that's most of the pharmacology industry is based on those unmyelinated monoamine systems. The drugs, etc. But the really fundamental personality is laid down in myelinated tracts very early. Those are not very plastic at all. So what you can tune up and down, the plasticity in the system is mostly these unmyelinated systems. But then, depending on the situation, they kind of snap back to where they were before. So it's a temporary plasticity. There's another kind of plasticity where you're using different parallel systems. There are backup systems for everything. And people who are very bright, for example, in mathematics or different proficiencies, they have multiple ways of doing that or solving problems, and that's associated with a higher IQ. So the plasticity there is the ability to call up backup systems and parallel systems as part of the processing. So you process faster because it's like a parallel processor, and so it seems like your new pathways are being brought up. They're not new pathways; they're just pathways that are adjunct pathways that are there that are being amped up in a certain situation. So that's functional plasticity, but it doesn't mean that you're making new connections. Okay, so I think that's a really an oversold thing. So
Okay.
there are people who naturally can do that. And, if you look at males versus female brains, the way males and females do things in their brain is generally different. Women will use multiple pathways in different situations than men and can be more proficient in certain things. The way they do it, even if they come up with the same answers as fast, they still can use different systems. So there's that sort of parallel processing. The thing with psilocybin and is that what it does is it affects an area of the brain called the mid dorsal anterior cingulate, and that's part of this. It's it would be right at the base of a yarmulke. If you put the yarmulke in your head and you went down, you drilled down about 3 or 4 inches, it'd be right there. So there's a point there, and that has to do to attention. This whole cingulate loop, different parts of it attend to different parts of your functions. So the back part of this attends to visual attention. The upper part is to your motor system, and then to your sensory system. And as you get toward the front of this cingulate, it's connected to a function, to higher functions, for executive function, and then to emotions, and then if you all the way around to your guts. And so people that have this part of the brain that's always turned on, it's usually associated with depression, because they're always associated with things inside them, and it's their inner emotional state and their guts. And so people who don't have that, they tend not to be depressed. And so these systems have very profound effects if they're more or less turned on most of the time. Now, the area of the brain that's affected by psilocybin is the area that shows attention to your parietal cortex, having to do with not only sensation, but your perception of yourself. That is, and so if you look at that parietal cortex that's affected, that's connected to this, people who have damage to it, if you pinch their arm, they can feel the pinch. If you say move your arm, you can move their arm, but they'll still say, if they're in the hospital, they'll ask the nurse to come in and remove this thing in the bed with them, because they don't have ownership of the arm or the leg. That's a parietal cortex symptom. Now, this area of the brain that connects to that in the cingulate cortex, it's called the midcingulate, is the area that is turned off by psilocybin. So what you do is you change your perception of ownership of things in your body, but also worrying about it. And so that's used in people. There was a clinical trial done at NIH with psilocybin, and in people with chronic pain having to do with cancer. And if you take that, what happens is you may still feel the pain, but you don't care about it.
Interesting.
So it's this not caring about it. And that's not so personal. It's like deeply you. And so there are, like 4 different pain pathways. One is the actual feeling of it, and then it's how you feel about it. And then this sense of cosmic angst, like this pain means I'm not going to exist, and therefore this gives great psychological pain, and it has to do with your sense of existence, and this very dark sort of feeling that you're not going to exist anymore, and that pain reminds you. So that's what these things do. They turn off that. So even if they're not affecting the pain per se, you don't worry about the pain. It's like, yeah, I feel it, but I don't care about it, And I certainly don't have any, angst about it. It doesn't have anything to do with my, mortality. So that's what they tend to affect, are those systems.
That you also, speaking of like being able to rewire the brain, I know you do a lot of stuff in stem cell. Could you talk a little bit about that? Is there any? I don't know much about it. I just know, for instance, someone had a shoulder injury when they were in their 50s that I knew, and got some stem cells injected in their arm, and their shoulder healed like no other treatment would have worked for them. Is this something that's also potentially useful in brain degeneration? Or
DARPA grant to look at the use of growth factors and stem cell therapy for prosthetic devices, arm or leg blown off, and so the idea is that there are some cells that are cut off, they're injured, right? They're snapped off, but they still have axons. And if you go in and you can save them with the growth factor, with the stem cells will secrete, which are growth factors, then that will keep the cell bodies in the spinal cord alive. And then if you provide a pathway, either artificially or along a nerve graft, that they will then regrow. They're there, but then they have to regrow to their targets again, which may be the skin or the muscle or gland. So that is one way with the stem cell / growth factor therapy, is taking cells that have been, the axons have been broken, but there's enough there so that they will re-sprout and go back, and you'll get recovery of function. The other thing is that if there's an injury, there are stem cells, endogenous stem cells, that are all along the ventricles, the fluid-lined spaces in the brain, and they're laying there. And if you have an injury signal and you add the appropriate growth factor, these stem cells can be made to divide and then start making connections. And we showed this. We got a patent for it, and we were looking at it for Parkinson's and also chronic stroke to develop. So you can do that, and that's recruiting new stem cells that are already there, but having them divide, and they will migrate from that area around the ventricles or the central canal and the spinal cord. They can migrate and then they'll start making connections if you have the right growth factor there and the right injury signal, right cytokines. And so you have to have those together at the right place at the right time, and that can make regrowth. And we showed that back in the late 90s and early 2000s.
I don't want to take up too much of your time, but one of the things that I did want to ask you, because as we talk about these things like psychopathy or cognitive versus emotional empathy, at USC, actually, there was the dean of our medical school was ousted after they found out he had been smoking meth and partying with prostitutes and just a wild lifestyle. To what extent?
He was acting like a rock star or a politician. I mean,
yeah, to what extent is that common in the academy, or is most people, when they think of professors or intellectual life, they do not expect this, right?
Well, but the psychopathy is 1.5% of the population, and borderline, if you include borderline, about 5%. And it's in all cultures. It's in every culture on the planet, and it's distributed there. In some, it's got a higher representation in some professions. For example, journalism, a higher percentage, and in politics, but anything where there's leadership, and the leadership, there was a study done that was a couple of years ago that looked at psychopathic traits in U.S. presidents, and they ranked them from high to low. By the way, George Bush Sr. had one of the lowest, who just died. The guy was a mensch. I mean, he had the lowest psychopathy ranking of any president. The guy was me, and everybody who knew him. Now everybody's talking about it. Doesn't matter your politics. What a great guy he was. He was a very, very good man. But at any rate, these were ranked, and the people. It turns out that the presidents with the highest percent of psychopathic traits turned out to be the ones that most people think had the highest leadership skills.
Wow.
And so people will confuse or think that the psychopathic traits has to do with leadership. And so we vote them in. I mean, we're the problem, not them, right? We vote in these people.
Is that a confusion, or is that a legitimate point?
I think it's a legitimate thing. It's like, I hate to have a crooked attorney, but as long as he's working for me, he can be crooked for me. Yeah. Or I don't want anybody on it, but I know this mafia guy that can, rough somebody up. So people are quite hypocritical about this. And but we choose these people, and it's a natural thing. And one of them is that these traits of this glibness and this narcissism, and what it looks like to people is charisma. So somebody walks through the door, and probably the president with the highest percentage of psychopathic traits, Bill Clinton by far. And when he walks through the door, they have the light around them, and people just love them and are attracted to them. But there's the same way with the pro-social psychopaths. People love them because they've got this confidence. I want this guy on my team. Very confident, very glib, very smooth, never seems anxious, because psychopaths never are anxious, right? So they seem very honest and all that. And so they get away with anything. But so there are leadership positions. Now, those leadership positions are also in industry and also in medical schools, right?
Right.
that people want. We want a strong leader. They're going to get money for us in the medical school. We're going to be successful because he's got these jobs. Well, it's not surprising that people, other professors, the other administrators, said this guy's got charisma. He can fight for us. He'll be able to get money. He'll be able to have national prominence. So that's us choosing these people. And so no, it's not unusual at all. That's we tend to find the higher percentage. Now, a full-blown psychopath, it'd be tough to be in a position like that. So people think that CEOs of big corporations, that's where they're psychopaths. There's almost no psychopaths, none in these big corporations. But in these startup companies, and it was great for Wolf of Wall Street. And I know the producer of that, and we did a panel together with Bryan Cranston, myself, and Winter, who did the screenplay and wrote that.
Oh, wow.
It's a perfect sort of characterization. It's the small company CEO. That's where you find that not in big companies. I mean, people love to hate big corporations, but you don't find psychopaths there.
Mm. Just because it's too high stakes or too legitimate.
Too many people, they're under too many eyes, and they will make mistakes, and their behavior will become somewhat disorganized, and they'll make mistakes with people, okay, and they'll be found out. But if you're a startup company, you're supposed to be rambunctious and everything, and so for that short period of time of the startup, several years, you're not caught. But if you're you're in corporations for years, you're not going to. There's no full psychopaths in those.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen. But the psychopathic traits are another thing because people like those traits, the pro-social traits.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Dr. Fallon, so much for your time. You're welcome to come back anytime. This has been just a very wide-ranging discussion. I know how I first had heard of you, but there's evidently a lot more to talk about. Do you have anything you want to plug or anything like that?
No, I just got to tell you, I just made this all
up. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I could do another if you're interested. You can talk about other things sometime. But you're very good. You're a very good interviewer, and it helps me smart, but you also have a flow, which is great. So I
appreciate that.
Much enjoyed this, even though we just contacted, an hour and a half ago, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you really had no time to prepare. So I'm very impressed with your ability to just right out of the box start talking like this, because I didn't give you any time to prepare.
No, well, I'm glad you pulled the trigger on it. It's always good to do now.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we'll talk again sometime, Duncan.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Alrighty, bye-bye. Alright, folks, that was it. Hope you enjoyed listening to Dunk Tank. See you next time.